Hi, this is Shira Schiowitz, and tonight we'll be learning Mizmor Nun Hey, Tehillim Psalm 55, in memory of Sarah Dratch, Sarah Rivka, Bat Harab Nachum Lemindel. Whenever I approach a Mizmor of Tehillim, I ask myself two questions. The first question is, how is this Mizmor similar to other Mizmorei Tehillim that I've seen? And often I think sometimes we have this, many of the Mizmorim of Tehillim seem actually very similar. So this is my first question, and Psalm 55 has a lot of elements that are similar to other Mizmorim in the sense that it is in many ways a classic lament, a cry to God, a tefillah Lashem be'et tzara, a cry to God from suffering. And it has many of the elements of the classic lament. It has the initial call to God to listen to my prayer, then it has a very involved complaint. It has an imprecation, a curse against the enemies, and at the end, a statement of confidence in God's salvation. The second question that I like to ask, though, is how is this psalm unique? What's different about this mizmor? And once we go through this mizmor, I think this question will be an interesting one, where we can see what this mizmor has to add that's unique and different. So what I'll do is it's 24 psukim, which is a little bit lengthy, so we're not going to read most of the psukim. We won't read inside, but as we go through it, I'll discuss the structure and highlight some of the key psukim. Okay, so the Mizmor starts out, Ha'azina Elohim tfilati v'al titalei mitchinati. Listen, Hashem, to my prayer, do not ignore my plea. And once the psalmist has implored God to listen, then he turns to a very involved and detailed complaint. And what he's suffering from, we find out, is trouble from his enemies. And the fear of the enemies has become so intense that he fears the enemies the same way that he fears death. Now, this fear is so intense that his one desire at the beginning of the Mizmor is simply to escape this intense fear that follows him when he's in the city. And what he really desires is escape and solitude. In Pasuk Zayin, he says, "Va'omar mi yitain li ever kayona a'ufa ve'eshkona." I said, if only I had the wings of a dove, a peaceful bird, I would fly away and find rest. Hine archik nadod alin bamidbar sela. I would flee far off and I would lodge in the wilderness. And this is that intense desire for seclusion, an escape from the chaos and the struggles that confront him on an everyday basis. When he's in society, his one desire is to escape. And that dove, while he's trapped in his physical body and therefore can't really escape his situation, if only he were a bird, he could fly off and find a place of solitude. Now, interestingly, really ironically, his safe place is the desert, and the desert is usually a place of unsatisfied needs and a place of death. But ironically here, that desire for seclusion is so intense that the illusion of safety that would come from the desert overcomes the general fears of the lack of food and the death that usually confronts man in the desert. Once he finishes that desire, then he continues to discuss what confronts him in the city and the corruption in the city, where the qualities of the city, violence and conflict, are personified as the watchmen of the city. So no good can come in or out because the city is guarded by evil qualities, and inside the city is mirma, duplicity. And we find out that this really is the dominant quality of his enemies. Once we reach verse 13, we have a revelation in the hands of by the psalmist, where he tells us what's really bothering him. Why is this suffering and pain by the enemies so intense? And he says, "Hilo oyev yachlifeni ve'asa." It's not an enemy who reviles me. I could bear that. Lo misani alai higdil. It's not my foe who makes himself great against me. Va'aster mimenu. If so, I would hide from him. Va'ata enosh ka'arki. But it's you, my equal. Alufi umiyudai. Not just my equal, my companion and my friend. And here's where we get to the inner core of what's eating at the psalmist. The person who's become his enemy is someone who used to be his friend. He suffered a betrayal. It's for this reason why the Chazal associate this Mizmor with David HaMelech, who was betrayed by his trusted advisor Achitophel, who turned to his son Absalom during Absalom's rebellion. But this is really the core. There's no reference to that specific event, but it correlates with this feeling. But it's written in a very universal tone. But the core of his angst is the betrayal, the friend who used to be there for him, who now has turned on him. And interestingly, there's actually in all of his discussion of his fears, which we haven't seen, we didn't read through all the psukim, but it's an intense fear. There's no fear of physical aggression. The his his fear is of the is of living with that betrayal, and it's really being let down by the friend in an emotional way that supersedes his actually fear of physical violence that comes against him. At this point, the psalm seems to start to wind down in verse 17 in Pasuk Yud Zayin. Ani el Elohim ekra v'Adonai yosheni, and I call out to God, and God will save me. And Yud Zayin, Yud Chet, Yud Tet, the psalmist seems to wrap up with a confident, with a statement of confidence that God will save him, and that there will be a resolution to his trouble. And that's really where we would expect this psalm to end. But interestingly, it doesn't wind down there at all. And the last 5 psukim seem to almost build up again. Just to give you a sense of what's going on in those last 5 psukim, in Pasuk Chaf, the psalmist turns again to God and asks God to listen to him. Then he continues in the next 2 psukim to speak about again the treachery of his friend who tricked him with his soft, kind words, but who was really plotting against him. And then the strongest part of this psalm, of this section, is where he says that he expresses his confidence that God will save him, and his confidence that God will also punish Anshe Mirma, the people who have exhibited this duplicity, and a general exhortation to people to turn to God when you're suffering, because he says, Ani avtach, I believe in him, and he will, I trust in you, and God is one who will save you. Now, this is really the strangest part of this psalm, and the end of this psalm, from Pasuk Chaf until Chaf Daled, is so it almost appears like a self-contained unit, so much so that some of the form critics have suggested that Chaf through Chaf Daled are actually an independent tehillah that share a common theme with the most of Mizmor Nun Hey, and therefore we're attached to it because of that common theme, but really can stand alone. But they make an interesting distinction between the first part and the second part. The first part really focuses on the complaint. So the first part they categorize as a lament, a tefillah to Hashem be'etzara, a cry to Hashem at the time of suffering. But the second part, because of the emphasis on the confidence in God's salvation, and the thankfulness that God has been there for the thankfulness of the psalmist that God has been there for him, that they suggest should be categorized as a mizmor hoda'ah, mizmor of thanksgiving, thanking God for his salvation. Now, I think actually this tehillah is most interesting if we really just read it as one, because I think there's a very interesting message in reading this tehillah as one piece. Because the beauty of this is that it really emphasizes the connection and the fluidity of our emotions. We often think of a lament and a thanksgiving as 2 polar opposites. But really what this brings out is that they're more connected than we think. These 2 genres are much closer, because even in a time of joy, we're still touched by the suffering that we've experienced. And this sorrow helps us appreciate the salvation that the salvation that we're experiencing at that time. And at the same time, in the time, the second half of this mizmor brings out that even in I'm sorry, not the second half, but even in a case of suffering, there's still a strong piece of hopefulness in God, and in this case, that piece of hopefulness developed into even a thanksgiving and a confidence in the salvation that will come. And I think this point, this real connection between the lament and the thanksgiving, and the connectedness of sorrow, hopefulness, and joy really resonated with me in thinking about Sarah, because Sarah's joyfulness really was such a dominant characteristic. But as Rabbi Dratch mentioned, it was really a state of mind that she worked on. And even in hard times, this was something that was conscious and that Sarah cultivated. And that struck me as particularly appropriate in light of Mizmor Nun Hey.